Alright, so I got a couple different major Israel updates that I want to get to here with you guys. The first is the United States once again blocking a United Nations resolution calling for a ceasefire amid Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. And then we're also going to talk about Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, basically going to war with the Israeli government over remarks that he made comparing Israel's actions in Gaza to the Holocaust. So pretty bold statement there from Lula. Is he right? Well, we're going to discuss that. But first off here, from Reuters, they say the U.S. blocks a UN call for a Gaza ceasefire in third veto. So they say U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield told the 15-member body that the draft resolution could jeopardize ongoing talks between the U.S., Egypt, Israel, and Qatar, saying, quote, "We believe that the resolution on the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations, and demanding an immediate unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace. Instead, it could extend the fighting between Hamas and Israel." That's a pretty incredible argument there, right? She's saying that calling for an immediate ceasefire would prolong the fighting. It would not lead to a ceasefire. It would prolong the fighting. Why is she saying that? Well, her argument is that there are some sort of backdoor negotiations happening with the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, which obviously has a close connection with Hamas, and then Israel, that are going to result in something successful. And so this ceasefire resolution is not necessary. If anything, it's counterproductive. Now, the reason I think that this is pretty ridiculous is that, number one, if you want to have some sort of a deal on the table that results in, number one, a ceasefire, and number two, the return of all the hostages, well, guess what? Hamas just proposed one of those last week, and Israel denied it. They rejected it emphatically. Why? Because they don't want a ceasefire. So what the United States position here is, and they actually presented basically a competing resolution that they may vote on soon for a temporary ceasefire. That's what they want, right? They want an unconditional return of the hostages that Hamas has in their possession, and they want a temporary pause, maybe a little bit of sprinkling of humanitarian aid, and then for Israel to continue to eradicate Hamas. So, number one, this is not going to work, because if you're trying to negotiate with the other side, Hamas in this equation, and even if you despise Hamas with every fiber of your being, when you're doing a negotiation, including as a part of that negotiation that you're going to give up all of your leverage by giving us the hostages back, and then we are going to continue to try to eradicate you from existence, that's probably not going to result in a successful negotiation, right? When one side of the equation is saying part of this negotiation is we're going to completely eliminate you in your entirety, might not be successful there, right? So there was a resolution that was on the table. Hamas put it forward. A three-stage process over a months-long period of time to return every single hostage in exchange for a lasting ceasefire. The United States was opposed to that. Israel was opposed to that. Okay? And we've seen this from Benjamin Netanyahu and other members of his coalition. They don't really care about the hostages as much as they care about prolonging and expanding this war, because that is what is keeping them in power right now. They are willing to sacrifice, or in some instances, as we've already seen, to kill their own hostages inside of Gaza in order to make that happen. So that's become very clear at this point. I mean, the idea that you guys are negotiating something behind the scenes that's going to be more effective than international pressure calling for a ceasefire from the Security Council and from the United States of America, who unilaterally could end this tomorrow if they actually wanted to apply pressure on Israel. It's just utterly ridiculous, right? And, obviously I do think the hostages deserve to be returned home, but the United States policy and the Israeli policy is not going to result in that. Point blank, period. It's just not. And so we also had some statements here that were absolutely bizarre from the same UN representative, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. And she said this, an interesting choice of words: "We will continue to actively engage in the hard work of direct diplomacy on the ground until we reach a final solution." Again, not exactly the best choice of words, especially as we're going to get to here with major world leaders like Lula da Silva comparing Israel's actions in Gaza to the Holocaust. Not the best choice of words there with the quote-unquote final solution, whatever that means, right? We also have this update here from Prem Thacker, working for The Intercept now, and just summarizing what the Biden administration has done so far. Well, they, number one, vetoed a UN humanitarian pause, vetoed a UN ceasefire and hostage release, sent Israel $254 million of weapons without congressional approval, voted no on 153 to 10 ceasefire/hostage release UN vote, attacked the ICJ case as meritless and counterproductive, even though they found that it was plausible that Israel was in the midst of a genocide. They also cut funding to the UN agency UNRWA that was aiding Palestinians, and they also vetoed a UN ceasefire and hostage release again, so 3 times in a row. And the UNRWA part of this, I mean, I've talked about it, to a large extent on this channel, is really one of the most despicable parts of this. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of people, innocent men, women, children disproportionately, who are right now at risk of starvation. 80% of those under the UN Stage 5 categorization of starvation around the world are currently inside of Gaza, and you are going to, at this moment, while there's already not enough aid, medical supplies, food, clean drinking water, or any of that, getting into Gaza, you are going to further worsen the situation based on unproven, zero evidence provided claims from Israeli intelligence that 12 out of 13,000 UNRWA employees in some way had a connection to the October 7th attack inside of Israel. I mean, just utterly disgusting, and obviously hypocritical as well, because we've seen endless documentation of Israeli war crimes in Gaza, and not only do we not cut aid to them, we increase aid to them. Right? At least if the Biden administration had their way with that recent $14 billion extendo bill that he was pushing. Now, we also had this media angle, which I thought was, pretty interesting to say the least. The Associated Press decided to go with this headline, which is just, I mean, it's just so crazy. The U.S. vetoes an Arab-backed UN resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. An Arab-backed UN resolution. I mean, sure, there are probably Arab countries who are backing this resolution. But as pointed out here by Jeff, 13 out of the 15 on the Security Council voted in favor of the resolution. And they are Algeria, China, Ecuador, France, Guyana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Russia, Sierra Leone, South Korea, Slovenia, and Switzerland. You may notice, most of the countries are not Arab, okay? To say the least, right? I mean, don't know where the fuck they got that headline from. Just a very interesting choice there from the AP. Now, again, the U.S. sort of proposed this competing resolution as they were voting down the main one that was brought by Algeria. And, I mean, this one is obviously weaker. It's calling for a temporary Gaza ceasefire. And we're going to show some of the details here. It also says that they oppose the Rafah assault, right? Which is interesting because we already covered the stories here of, the Joe Biden administration openly admitting that, yeah, they want, or openly are stating that they want, Israel to think about the civilians, the over 1 million civilians who are living in a refugee camp or tent city in Rafah right now. They want Israel to think about them as they conduct this offensive into Rafah. But if you're not going to impose any sort of consequences, if you're not going to punish them, if you're not going to cut off aid to them or threaten them in any way, shape, or form, then saying you are against something or opposing it in a diplomatic way, it doesn't really mean much. I mean, again, the Biden administration, Joe Biden himself, single-handedly has the power to end this with a single phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu if he was willing to use his leverage in any capacity whatsoever. He's choosing not to do that. And so here's what they say. They say it would see the Security Council, quote, underscore its support for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, whatever that means, based on the formula of all hostages being released, and calls for lifting all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale. Okay, so first off, the Netanyahu government has been actively preventing humanitarian assistance from getting into Gaza at any reasonable capacity whatsoever, actively blocking it, taking steps to prevent aid from getting into Gaza as people are starving to death. And, on top of that, again, whatever this sort of general language here of whenever practicable, based on all hostages being released, we'll have a temporary ceasefire. I mean, to me, it's not going to happen, right? I mean, I wish all the hostages would get to go home, but when you're doing a negotiation with an organization like Hamas, and that is basically one of the only pieces of leverage they have to prevent Israel from entirely nuking the Gaza Strip or flattening it more so than they already have into oblivion, is having those hostages, then calling for a temporary ceasefire to have them give up their leverage, to give back all of the hostages, just so then Israel can continue their war to eradicate Hamas, and the rest of the Palestinian people for that matter, doesn't really seem like that's something they would agree to. Now again, they put a deal on the table. That was a plan to result in Israel withdrawing their troops as they should, and the release of all of the hostages, and a permanent ceasefire. Israel rejected that. I just want to make that very clear in terms of where we stand here and why this war is continuing as it is. Now, they describe what's actually in the draft that the U.S. put forward here. They say that the text would condemn calls by some Israeli government ministers for Jewish settlers to move to Gaza, like Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, the finance minister and the minister of national security. So condemning them, I guess, and would reject any attempt at demographic or territorial change in Gaza that would violate international law, which obviously, again, as I talked about yesterday, Israel is attempting to do. They are literally building a highway that separates the northern strip from the southern strip of Gaza in order to establish a buffer zone. They were also building that, 1.6 mile long, or mile ranged buffer zone around the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and they were demolishing innocent, Palestinian men, women, and children's homes in the process of doing that, and basically trying to set up a security zone, as they would call it, inside of the border of the entirety of Gaza. So that's a huge land grab. This indefinite potential occupation of the north of Gaza is also a huge land grab, and so I guess, it's something to condemn people who are openly calling for the resettling of Gaza, but again, in practice, if that's kind of what they're doing, and that's the trajectory that we're on, giving a light condemnation when you have the power to stop this immediately, it's pretty pathetic, right? And obviously that was one of the situations where they were establishing that buffer zone as well, that resulted in one of the deadliest days for IDF troops as well. When a Hamas militant or whatever fired an RPG at a tank in the area where they were laying down all of these explosives to do a controlled demolition of civilian housing, and it ended up blowing up the entire controlled, explosives that they had set up and killing a bunch of IDF guys as well, like over 20 of them at the time. But they continue down here. They say the resolution would also reject, quote, any actions by any party that reduces the territory of Gaza on a temporary or permanent basis, including through the establishment officially or unofficially of so-called buffer zones, as we just talked about, as well as the widespread systematic demolition of civilian infrastructure. So in terms of the demolition of civilian infrastructure, a little bit late for that. Guys, a majority of the buildings in the north of Gaza have been destroyed. Majority of the housing in Gaza has been destroyed. So the idea that, after they just flattened half of the Gaza Strip, that you're going to turn around and say, well, we're against you destroying civilian infrastructure. Guys, 30 plus out of the previously functioning 36 hospitals in Gaza are no longer functioning. Okay, they've attacked mosques, schools, UN shelters, refugee camps, all of that. So, a little bit late on that kind of a condemnation there. Now, I want to show you guys this quick clip here from Nancy Pelosi, who was doing this little sit-down interview. And basically, I don't know how else to describe it, just straight up lied and said that the United States is not arming Israel in their genocide in Gaza. So let's watch this real quick.
What Israel is doing, and the president has made it clear that some of what Israel is doing he doesn't like.
That's right.
And you go on supplying them with hardware to do those things. You own this operation every bit as much as they do, don't you?
No, we don't. We don't. We have always supported Israel as our national security friend, largely because it was in our interest to do so. We had shared values and only democracy in the region. The behavior of Netanyahu is, in my view, inexcusable in terms of how it has affected the collateral damage to children and families and the rest. But nobody can take away the right of any country to defend itself that has been brutally attacked in that way.
Last week, the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, wondered aloud why the US isn't doing more to have its warnings taken seriously in Jerusalem. If you believe, he said, that too many people are being killed, maybe you should provide fewer arms in order to prevent so many people being killed. He's got a point, hasn't he?
Israel is very well equipped with weaponry. There's nothing that we have sent since October 7th that has contributed to this brutality. In the longer run, they're in a dangerous neighborhood, and we will continue to support Israel.
If you don't.
Okay, so a couple different things there, right? Number one, what you just said at the end there, that the United States has not supplied Israel with any weaponry since October 7th. Just a straight up lie, right? Again, Biden went around Congress to help to give them weapons, right? We've done this in a number of different back channel ways. He's openly been pushing for, again, $14 billion additional dollars, many of which is going to be weaponry to support Israel to continue what they're doing in Gaza. We supply them with billions of dollars on an annual basis to help aid their military apparatus. The idea that we don't give them the weapons, that they're totally fine without us. Well, if they're totally fine without the United States giving them weapons, then cut off the weapons to them. I mean, the reality of this is you can go and look at previous statements from former Israeli prime ministers or top officials and members of the Knesset who openly admit if the United States stopped supporting Israel with our stockpiles of weapons, then this would not be able to happen, okay? This war in Gaza would not be able to continue. They would not be able to function as they currently do. That's a fact, guys. And so to come out and just brazenly lie like that, it really is like amazing. I don't know what world she's living in that she thinks people are going to buy this line of logic, but I guess go for it. Now, a couple of other things that she said there, right, towards the beginning, that number one, the United States is not really complicit in Israel's actions, and number two, that they're the only democracy. I mean, you cannot be a democracy and an apartheid state at the same time. Not really how the definition of those kinds of words works out there. But on the first point, not only is the United States complicit in like a moral sense with our diplomatic cover for Israel, vetoing the United Nations resolution and, sending them weapons and all of that, not only are we like hypothetically potentially liable for this, but also we are liable under international law. Israel is currently facing an ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world right now, at the United Nations, a case where they have already found that it's plausible that Israel is in the midst of a genocide. And if a country is committing a genocide, other countries like the United States are not only banned from supplying them and arming them and funding them to commit that genocide, but they actually have a legal obligation under international law to prevent them from engaging in that genocide. So the United States, Joe Biden, the rest of these people, they are actually potentially, liable under international law for consequences for aiding and abetting a genocide. So that was also remarkable. And just to finish off here on this first part, Israeli officials appear to have set a deadline to invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, the largest refugee camp in the coastal territory, for the Muslim holy day of Ramadan on March 10th. So they're planning this invasion of Rafah, and I don't think it's any coincidence that they planned it for Ramadan. I mean, they do this all the time. They go and they attack the Al-Aqsa Mosque on a regular basis, especially during holy periods within Islam, just to provoke a response and to do it because they can. And so now we move on to this. Lula da Silva basically came out with a hot take here, guys. And he said that Israel and their actions in Gaza are comparable to the Holocaust, right? So here's a direct quote. What is happening in the Gaza Strip with the Palestinian people has no parallel in any other historical moment. In fact, it did exist when Hitler decided to kill the Jews. And this sparked off a huge backlash from Israel. They, basically came out and said he's not welcome in the country until he takes back these remarks. He also recalled the Israeli ambassador from Brazil. So, I mean, this relationship is certainly tense, to say the least, at the moment. I mean, Lula also said here that the cutting off of the aid to UNRWA and urging an investigation into errors without cutting off funding to help those affected by what he called a genocide. He also said it's not a war between soldiers and soldiers, it's a war between a highly prepared military and women and children, which is, I mean, that's just a fact at that point, right? And of course, Israel's freaking out about this. They say it's a perverse distortion of reality and offends the memory of the Holocaust victims and their descendants, and it's extreme and unbalanced. That's interesting to me because I've actually heard and seen, survivors of the Holocaust or descendants of survivors of the Holocaust who have come out and spoken in favor of a ceasefire inside of Gaza, so that's interesting as well. They also said this, I mean, Netanyahu said this directly, this is a trivialization of the Holocaust and an attempt to attack the Jewish people and the right of Israel to self-defense. Drawing comparisons between Israel and the Nazis and Hitler is to cross a red line. So, I mean, number one, obviously, again, it's a bold statement to come out and to compare the only real, Jewish state in the world to the Nazis who massacred Jewish people. It is bold. Now, is he correct in drawing this kind of a historical comparison? I think he is. I mean, guys, I'll show you some of the data here in a minute. But before we get to the data that backs up that this is a totally unprecedented in the modern history of war kind of operation that Israel is conducting right now. Before we get into, again, a reminder that the ICJ found that genocide is plausible, that Israel is committing inside of Gaza, I just want to mention, what the fuck is the point of learning any sort of lessons from the Holocaust, right? This idea of never again. What's the point of even talking about the Holocaust or learning about the Holocaust if you are never able to make modern comparisons in an effort to try to prevent something like that from happening again? right? And I understand sometimes people are hyperbolic and over the top and they compare everybody to Hitler and the Holocaust and whatever, but this is a situation where we have had a totally unprecedented amount of civilians, innocent men, women, and children who have been killed at a rapid pace, where a vast majority of the civilian infrastructure is being destroyed, where people are within the Israeli government, the highest ranks of the Israeli government, are talking about a full-blown ethnic cleansing and pushing the entire population of Gaza out of the Gaza Strip and into the Sinai Peninsula. We are talking about a situation where hundreds of thousands of people are at risk of starvation, imminent starvation right now. We're talking about a situation where basically the entirety of the population of Gaza is going hungry, has no reliable access to clean drinking water, to food, to medical supplies, where the hospital infrastructure in Gaza has entirely been destroyed at this point. So, I mean, with all of that, and in combination with the statements that we hear from Israeli politicians dehumanizing Palestinians in a very similar way to what the Nazis did to the Jews during the Holocaust, comparing them to animals. I mean, literally calling them human animals, as Isaac Herzog once did, saying there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. I mean, statements like this matter. When Benjamin Netanyahu comes out and compares the situation with Israel's offensive into Gaza to Amalek, the biblical story of Amalek, in which it literally says to go and to destroy every man, woman, and child. What are we supposed to take from that? When we see IDF soldiers on the ground, committing war crimes, posting them online, bragging about them, laughing about them, repeating the words from top Israeli politicians as they are doing so, what are we supposed to take from that? What are we supposed to take from the reality here of some of the data that we're talking about? I mean, Israeli bombardment destroyed over 70% of Gaza homes. This is from December, over a month and a half ago at this point. I mean, this is another comparison point here from the AP. The Israeli military campaign in Gaza, experts say, now sits amongst the deadliest and most destructive in recent history. In just over 2 months, and so this is from January, researchers say that the offensive has wreaked more destruction than the razing of Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, as well as Ukraine's Mariupol, or proportionately, the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II. It has killed more civilians than the US-led coalition did in its 3-year campaign against the Islamic State group. When we're talking about, the battles against ISIS, like in Mosul, for example, when we're talking about Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, or Mariupol, for that matter, or Dresden during World War II in Germany, these are some of the most historically bombed out and destroyed places in history, okay? And what Israel has done in Gaza in a much shorter period of time far surpasses any of these other comparisons. So when Lula brings up a comparison to the Holocaust, he's not just pulling it out of his ass. It's not to downplay what happened during the Holocaust. Of course, 6 million Jews more died in the Holocaust. There's not even 6 million people living in Gaza. It's not about drawing a direct, number-to-number comparison, right? Or necessarily strategy-to-strategy comparison. It's about trying to use the lessons of the Holocaust to ensure that genocide never is able to happen again. That's the underlying lesson that should be learned. So the idea that it's crazy offensive to accuse Israel of genocide, or that it's anti-Semitic, as I've been saying the entire time, to critique Israel, or to accuse them of war crimes, or that it's blood libel. I mean, that is actually a much more of a perversion of the lessons that should have been learned from the Holocaust, at least in my opinion. But some more details on these comparisons. They say between 1942 and 1945, the Allies attacked 51 major German cities and towns, destroying about 40 to 50% of their urban areas, and said a U.S. military historian. And Poppy also said that this amounted to 10% of the buildings across Germany, compared to over 33% across Gaza. And this is now outdated. The number is significantly higher there. And again, 70% of the houses in Gaza have been destroyed so far. They say the U.S.-led coalition in the 2017 assault to expel ISIS from Mosul was considered one of the most intense attacks on a city in generations. That 9-month battle killed around 10,000 civilians. So already, they've killed, in Gaza, 3 times more civilians in a fraction of the time. And a third of them, in this Battle of Mosul, were from coalition bombardment. They say during the 2014 to 2017 campaign to defeat ISIS in Iraq, the coalition carried out nearly 15,000 strikes across the country. Okay, over a 3-year period, 15,000 strikes. By comparison, the Israeli military last week, and this is earlier from January here, conducted 22,000 strikes in Gaza. Let me say it again. Israel launched more strikes in Gaza, a much smaller area, by the way, 22,000 more strikes in 1 week, than the U.S. did, or the entire coalition did, across a 3-year period in trying to defeat ISIS in Iraq. I mean, it is historically incomparable to anything else. Again, here another one from CNN. Not seen since Vietnam. Israel dropped hundreds of 2,000-pound bombs on Gaza, analysis shows. This is stuff that even the United States military has said they would never do on such a densely populated area. Israel dropped hundreds of these 2,000-pound bombs, where the radius for potential injury is like hundreds of yards, okay? So the notion that it's totally absurd to bring up the Holocaust or World War II or any of these other comparisons, it would be absurd not to. It would be absurd to pretend that what Israel is doing right now in Gaza is normal. It's not normal. I mean, proportionately, it's worse than anything that we have seen in modern history. You got to go all the way back, as they point out here, to Vietnam, which was in and of itself one of the greatest crimes against humanity that we've seen over the last 100 years, with the indiscriminate killing of innocent children and men and women. You have to go back to Vietnam to make a comparison point here. Proportionately, it doesn't even compare to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's the kind of shit that we're talking about. So, no, it shouldn't be offensive that Israel or that Lula is bringing up the Holocaust as a comparison point here. It should be offensive to people, the notion that any sort of comparison to the Holocaust, to condemn a current genocide, that should be offensive to people. Because the lessons from the Holocaust is supposed to be never again for anybody. Not just never again for Jewish people, not never again for any one specific group of people, never again. We established an entirely new set of global international laws, the Geneva Conventions, in order to try to prevent what happened during the Holocaust and during World War II from ever happening again. And so it's important that we understand what happened in the Holocaust, are honest about it, and then use the lessons from that to try to prevent that from happening. And yet they're offended by this. They're going to battle with Lula over this. I mean, I kind of skipped over this statement here from Israel, but they're going on Twitter and getting into, I guess, like sassy quote tweet battles with Lula. I mean, what comes to mind when you think of Brazil? Just like this random tweet here from World of Statistics. They say before or after he went full on Holocaust denial. It's not Holocaust denialism. Lula da Silva is not a Holocaust denier. He's bringing up a historic genocide in order to make a comparison point to a current genocide. That's what he's doing. And I think that it's totally fine to do it, although it is, again, a bold move. So anyways, I'll finish off there. It's not unexpected. We knew that the United States was going to veto this resolution. I don't think their counter resolution is going to go anywhere. But I'll have more updates for you guys tomorrow, because we definitely got a lot more to talk about in regards to Israel and Gaza. And it unfortunately doesn't look like this is realistically going to end anytime soon.